Welcome to the Stewart Squared podcast. We have a special guest today joining us, Jim Ward, who my dad, Stewart Alsop, is partnering with on his new fund, all about the third convergence and reality disturbance, which we've talked about before. And this show really goes into the history of the personal computing industry, the rise of the internet, and the rise of the mobile phone in order to understand where we're going with both AI and other deep frontier texts that will really change the nature of life here on Earth. So welcome, Jim, and welcome, Dad.
Hey,
Hey.
good to be here.
So, for our rabid listeners, Jim and I are starting a fund called TK Media Tech Ventures, and we have a very specific thesis for this fund and have been running around pitching people on investing in it. So we thought we'd probably start off by running that, and then that'll give us a basis on which to talk about. A good portion of the pitch has our backgrounds, which we don't have to spend a lot of time on, but the thesis for our fund is the interesting part. So you guys good with that?
Sounds great.
Sure.
So put it up there, Jim,
Yeah, well, here, hang on a minute.
and the first slide. We start off by asking our audience at any time if they know what TK means, and it's sort of a way to back into what the thesis of our fund is. But I explain that I've been around for a long time, including back in high school, setting hot type for the school newspaper, and then working my way through all of the different technologies that have come along, dedicated systems for word processing and then eventually the personal computer with word processing and when we worked on manuscripts before there were computers, when we knew there was something that had not been included in the manuscript, we'd put a little caret and the letters TK, and it meant to come. And it was a way of making sure that when we're editing a manuscript, we don't leave something out when it's published. And then when everything became digital, first with the dedicated systems and then with the personal computer, it turned out that TK is a letter pair that doesn't exist in the English language. So when you're editing a manuscript on a computer, you could search for TK and find all the places where there was something left out. So this is an obscure term and really only relevant and interesting to people that have been in the editing business for a long time, although it's still used in editing. And so we named the firm TK because it means to come, and we're investing in what's to come, particularly in media technologies. And so that's the way we start off the pitch.
Yeah, and it's a great icebreaker. Stuart suggested this name, and I was like, "What are you even talking about?" But it actually has worked out really well as a great kind of icebreaker to get into the discussion. But at this point, I basically take over and clarify that we are actually investing first and foremost in technology. This is not a play where we're investing in movies and other types of content in the entertainment industry, because that, frankly, is a risky proposition and can scare away a lot of people. But rather, we are investing in technology that will enable a hopefully flourishing creative outburst at the intersection of these innovative media technologies and the development of content. Because for the next 20 years, we fundamentally believe that reality will be disturbed. And I'll explain what that means in a second. Because we are on the eve of what we call the third convergence. And Stuart and I are old enough to have been around for the first two convergences, which you might ask, what are those? Well, the first convergence was identified by Nicholas Negroponte in 1979 when he was running MIT's Media Lab. And he basically predicted that the worlds of publishing, broadcasting, and this new emerging world of personal computing and power on the desktop would create all types of avenues for the digitization of media. And of course, he was right. Over the next 30 years, we saw the emergence of nonlinear editing that turned into word processing and nonlinear editing in the film business. Digital capture, digital streaming, the cable industry, the emergence of streamers, all of the technology that has come about actually came from this original prognostication. The second convergence was dubbed that by a guy named Hugh Dubberly, who was a media pundit. And he said, look, all of this technology from the past 30 years that has emerged is somehow going to need to be networked together, thus kind of predicting the emergence of what we now know as the cloud, converging with all things social media, which obviously we've seen that tremendous growth in social media, converging with the Internet of Things, the ability to geocache, create smart environments, smart clothing, smart everything. And of course, he was also right, and that has been happening and is currently happening. So the fundamental question is there going to be a third convergence? And we believe there is, but we are calling it the reality disturbance, because for the first time in human history, our reality as we know it is going to be fundamentally disturbed through the rise of all of the buzzy technologies that everyone is talking about now, generative AI, XR, VR, AR, all of that, creating new digital worlds, whether we call it the metaverse, the multiverse, the omniverse, whatever it happens to be. But here's the insight. No one wants to live 24/7 in the Ready Player One world of Mark Zuckerberg. We can't in reality because we are sentient human beings tied to the physical plane in which we exist. We eat food, we have to go to the doctor, we get sick, we die. And until 100 years from now, quantum physics figures out how to convert us into digital beings, we are stuck as human physical beings as well. But therein lies the insight and the opportunity, because there's going to be an emergence of technologies that need to bridge from our physical worlds into these new digital virtual worlds. And that's what Stuart and I are going to be investing in. And in fact, there's great opportunity across a spectrum of different types of technologies that will enable this bridge to this reality disturbance. One of the areas is in the video games market, which obviously is huge, in microtransactions, which should be a $121 billion business in the next couple of years. And one of the holy grails in the video game business, and I used to run one and I still play video games, is as I grind away in Fortnite, my fantasy would be to take my real world behavioral patterns and most importantly, my physical currency expenditures and somehow instantaneously in real time translate those into the digital currency that I actually use in the video game that I play. And as an example, Stuart and I have sourced a company called Atlas Reality, who is building what we think is the Unreal Engine of the physical to digital convergence of currency. In other words, as a 19-year-old, I can go to Burger King every day and buy my Whopper, and that $4 or whatever a Whopper costs these days instantly gets converted into the digital currency of my game, whether it's Fortnite or whatever else I'm playing. And so what Atlas Reality did was create a test bed for this, and they created a game called Atlas Earth, where you can go and buy digital real estate, et cetera, et cetera. But the interesting thing is the test game itself, Atlas Earth, has turned into a monster, and last year did $50 million just as a test game. So it is validating the thesis, it's validating the behavioral pattern and the need itself. Again, a bridge from the physical world to the virtual worlds in which we're going to be more and more involved. Another area that Stuart and I know very well is the immersive entertainment marketplace, which is exploding right now, and everybody's getting their feet wet in creating experiences in a physical area or a retail type of situation. And of course, Stuart was an early investor in a company called Meowwolf, which I'm sure you guys have talked about in previous podcasts. And Stuart asked that I go out and take a look at this to validate his thesis. They blew me away. And as it turned out, I ended up dropping into the company as a CEO for a number of years. So we both know this space very intimately. Yet here's the challenge for these LBEs, these location-based entertainment places. They're somewhat limited within the four walls of their physical experience, and they need to begin to evolve into cross-reality experiences. Again, begin to figure out how to overlay a digital experience and create bridges between the two. And so there are great opportunities in this space with companies who are building, again, the Unreal Engine of immersive entertainment, which will allow us to create amazing experiences in what we call the experience economy. That's very important for the evolution of this segment. So we're looking at those companies as well. Another area that's near and dear to my heart is the visual effects marketplace. And having been involved with Lucasfilm previously and Industrial Light and Magic, there's all sorts of opportunity here. You might be aware of a television show called The Mandalorian, where ILM created unique digital screens, if you will, to create or replace the need for green screen special effects work after something's shot, because now they can generate through generative AI amazing imagery, put it up on those digitized screens and shoot in real time. Problem is, it's very, very expensive to do. And we found a company called Kubrick, who was featured on 60 Minutes on a piece on NVIDIA, because Kubrick's using the NVIDIA chips. And Kubrick's been able to leverage generative AI and democratize this ability to leverage these images and bring them into a physical world. Most notably me as a lowly independent filmmaker on my desktop, and be able to leverage this as well. A whole nother area is exploding, and I'm sure you guys have talked about this, is the emergence of avatars. And certainly in the service sector and in a number of areas, avatars are exploding. But certainly in entertainment and video games, this is yet another holy grail, is to have avatars that can pass the Turing test to increase the overall engagement, stickiness, and frankly fun of any interactive entertainment experience, be it a video game or an interactive film or whatever ends up taking place. Most importantly, once I enter these digital worlds that are being created, if I can have an avatar that can pass the Turing test and be ultimately a true companion, that's pretty cool, and take that into my everyday life. Another area, and we've identified companies that are doing this as well. Another area is in the global collectibles market, which is over $1 trillion. And it's not going away. People love to collect stuff. But there's not been a bridge between your physical collection of things that you have on your desktop and the new breed of digital collectibles, either digital assets that you buy in video games or digital assets that, yes, might be NFTs, but most importantly are tracked on the blockchain. There's a great opportunity to connect the two. The physical asset that you have on the desktop can be twinned to a digital asset, and together they can accrue value. And ultimately, you can take that digital asset and, in another holy grail moment, be able to take that digital asset and transfer it from game to game or digital entertainment experience to digital entertainment experience. So imagine if I'm have a lot invested in my Obi-Wan Kenobi Jedi in a particular game, and I can take that Jedi into Fortnite. That would be really cool. And I happen to have a physical item on that. I can buy, sell, and trade that item as well. So great opportunities there, and we're looking ultimately at companies in those spaces. And these are just 5 examples of the vertical buckets, if you will, of technologies that are going to explode to bridge the physical with the digital world, thus helping us manage and navigate this reality disturbance. Look, Stuart and I think, are uniquely positioned, not just because we're old geezers, but we've lived through the first and second convergence. Stuart is I won't say grizzled, I'll leave that for myself, a pleasant and pundit and a long-term veteran media advisor. And I'm a veteran media operator. I've run all types of companies in this space. And we've both managed and invested in the first convergence and been successful. The second convergence been successful. We've also learned from our mistakes. But that positions us perfectly to identify this third convergence and capitalize on the opportunities through TK Media Tech Ventures. I'll stop there and go into our background, Stuart, but that's basically our thesis. And then
Yeah.
however you.
No, I think that's probably the place to stop. I mean, we're not actually trying to raise money here on on a
I
podcast. It's
I have
the
so
deal is to explain our thesis and why we have such a clear idea about what's going to happen in the third convergence.
Yeah, and I have a lot of questions to follow up on that. With the theme of the show, I would love to understand because you're describing a science fiction reality. And for the past 20 to 30 years, there have been some kind of science fiction things, but it's been more cyberpunk. It's been very sort of dystopian, like what happens when technology enters our lives in this dystopian way. I would love to understand from both of you that growing up, as you did with the sci-fi, like the real sci-fi novels about robots and about artificial intelligence and about all this different stuff, what does it feel like now to see it start taking place? And you can, and if you don't agree with that assumption, you feel free to
I always refer to it as a Dick Tracy moment. And you have to kind of be old to know who Dick Tracy is.
I remember.
But he would, he'd talk to his watch or his device on his wrist. And it's like, you could do that now. So we've gotten from there back then when it was like a comic book and comic artist is trying to envision what the future would be like to now we actually have it. And that crosses all kinds of domains. So I think I'll, for myself, say that part of the reason you're interested in my life story is because we have been through these convergences, these technology transitions, and at least gives us some notion of a pattern for what's going to happen in the future. And right now with AI, there's what are the terms? Accelerationists and I can't
Effective,
remember what the opposite is, but
effective accelerationists and doomers.
doomers. I'm an accelerationist. It's like, all the things we've been worried about in technology transitions, going all the way back to the telephone and telegraph and airplanes and all the other them, have scared people. And being scared is actually a good thing. So that's my attitude towards the whole thing is that ultimately human beings rule and, we'll make what we make of it. And I think Jim and I agree on that.
What do you think, Jim?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think there are two kind of touchstones in my life to answer your question, Stuart. The first is I grew up watching the Jetsons, and the Jetsons for me was mind blowing because it was a silly cartoon thing, but the kinds of technologies and things that robots and flying cars and all this stuff was just captivated my young mind at that point in my life. And then I discovered through my career, my life is Forrest Gump, except it really happened. In other words, I've been able to bump into and work with amazing people, not because I'm particularly talented, but I just stumbled into these situations. And I got to work with Steve Jobs and then ultimately John Sculley. And the second touch point was in 1987. John did a video called The Knowledge Navigator. And if you haven't seen that video, for listeners out there, you got to go watch it. And it was keyed off of Negroponte, all of the pundits at the time, but John actually created a video to explain a vision of the future. And in that video, it laid out, desktop computing, portable computing, the forerunner of Siri as a personal assistant, Zooms, digital interaction, being able to skip to knowledge databases around the world, having URLs link you, all of everything that came to be is in that video. And I remember I helped work on that, but ultimately what that came to be was like, okay, now some of this Jetsons stuff is actually happening. And man, if this stuff can actually happen, that would be really cool. And lo and behold, it all came to pass. So now, like Stewart, we're not afraid to dream big because we've seen it actually happen. There's a track record of that, and we've been a part of help make it happen, and all of those things. Whether it's my further bumping into Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer or George Lucas or whomever it happens to be, who are at the forefront of these technological changes. So to me, the Jetsons and Knowledge Navigator kind of are my points, and they happened. So I believe in our future and our confidence. The other thing I would just add is, and Stuart and I and Gilman, our other partner, talk about this a lot, is unfortunately, however, the promise that Apple made in 1984, that 1984 wouldn't be 1984, hasn't necessarily come to pass. And so we've also learned a lesson of governance around technology and the true purpose of technology, and making sure that technology is actually can be beneficial versus some of the darker sides of that as well. So,
okay, a lot we can go into there. The first thing I would love to understand more about is Dubberly. You said that John Scully made the Knowledge Navigator video, but according to Perplexity just now, Dubberly was also involved. And then, which relates to my other question, which is that you were there at Apple with Steve Jobs in the late 80s. And then, but I also saw on your, I did another Perplexity search that you are also involved with the PowerBook.
yes.
What are all those different threads? So can you explain more about how Dubberly is involved with both Apple and that second Convergence?
Well, so they're separated by decades. So Hugh Dubberly worked in Apple's, I believe, Marcom group, and worked on that Knowledge Navigator video. Years later, having his own agency and that type of thing, he became sort of a pundit, and that's when he talked about this whole second Convergence. But literally, it was separated from 1987 to 2000.
So at some level, though, Hugh must have had the Knowledge Navigator in the back of his head and trying to figure out when it would actually happen, right? That there would be this broadband internet and all of the parts associated with it. He may not have seen the iPhone or a mobile phone as part of that, but certainly as a desktop experience.
Yeah, and the whole concept of a personal experience, and then in a personal assistant, excuse me. You mentioned the PowerBook because that was a seminal moment. Steve had left the company in the famous boardroom crew, and John had come aboard. But the problem is that Apple severely missed the boat by introducing what we fondly call the Apple Luggable, which is a 16-pound, supposedly portable computer. And the entire industry was wrapped up with the idea of being able to take your work that you would do in the workplace and take that and go sit out on a cliff and be able to do your work from a cliff. And there's like 59 ads of showing people literally sitting in Yosemite, a Silicon Valley fantasy, sitting in Yosemite on a cliff working on your spreadsheet, right? And so Apple fumbles the ball, if you will, on this 16-pound luggable. And John was hell-bent on democratizing the Macintosh platform, and we had helped him introduce the LC and the Mac Plus and products like that were cheaper priced, and they're very successful. And so he thought, well, we need to do that same thing for the laptop. And in design, came up with this concept of something that you could literally carry around with you like a book. And pushing that further in conversations with the design team and John, et cetera, it became apparent that the opportunity wasn't simply to take your work with you to go and sit on a cliff and do Excel sheets, that in essence, that this thing now called the PowerBook could become the first example of a personal assistant, that you literally could have your entire life with you to help you manage your life, not just work, but your entire life. And there's a whole long story here, but that's why we developed this award-winning, successful campaign of what's on your PowerBook. And the whole concept behind that was that your life is on your PowerBook. And this was the first example of a real personal assistant, and ultimately, took the marketplace by storm and all of that type of thing. But so these antecedents, these seeds were being planted even in form factors back in 92 and 93 with the introduction of what became known as the PowerBook.
Brilliant. So 1960s Licklider. Licklider was working at DARPA, and he essentially came up with the fundamental idea of human augmentation. That there's artificial intelligence was also seeded at this time, but there was a debate between whether this is human augmentation versus whether this is a fully fundamentally different form of intelligence. And so Licklider came up with this, and then fast forward to everything you just talked about, this PowerBook in early 2000s was this idea of a personal assistant, like a computer that augments your life. And it now feels like we're there. We're now here with AI, but as I've been discovering the last week with Claude MCP servers, I have this technology that is way smarter than me, particularly coding. I'm not technical, but I'm now building applications. It's way smarter than me for most of the things, but then it makes these little probabilistic mistakes at 0.01% of the time that screw up the whole application. And so this is inside of a large code base. It's coding all of my things now. It's got like 200, 300 lines of code for each of these different things. And it's making these small little mistakes that neither I nor it can solve. So really interesting augmentative capability. If you have anything to say on that particular sort of arc, but I would really like to dive into where this is going in terms of the reality disturbance with this assistant. What role does this assistant play with reality disturbance?
Well,
Welcome to Stewart Squared.
well, look, let's take one step back, and I think Stuart and I agree on this. There's been a gold rush to the concept of AI, right? Yeah. And if you look at the Gartner, curve, the hype curve, and all of that, there's AI in it. Everybody's running to do that. The challenge is the issue isn't AI. That's simply yet another tool in the toolbox of creating these experiences and leveraging computing power in new ways. And so, the area of AI we look at not as simply, oh, they're doing AI, so let's go invest in them.
Yeah.
What we really push on and use as a filter is to what end? What is that tool actually doing in terms of a fundamental benefit or problem that it happens to be solving? And you'll be shocked because when you push on that and use that filter, a lot of times we're running across companies that are simply doing AI because it's cool and it's AI, and the problem they're solving isn't really like, my great example is every board in America today in the private sector is sitting in a boardroom with the CEO, and they're saying, well, what are we doing with AI? We got to do something with AI. CEO, what are you doing? You're missing the boat. We're missing the AI thing. And so the CEO then turns around and says to his product people, we got to do something with AI. And so all of a sudden now we have on the marketplace toothbrushes with AI. And at the end of the day, do we really need AI to help us on the toothbrush front? I don't know, maybe, but the examples that I've seen have been really kludgy, right? It's like silly. So part of this is really discerning the tool set versus the solution it's solving and what ultimately that means. So I just want to level set there, and I'll turn it over to Stuart.
Yeah, and let me draft off that. This is not new. Even in AI, this is not new. The conditions we're operating in now are much different, but I'll provide an anecdote. There was a company called Symantec, Symantec, and the company was originally funded to develop agents using natural language and expert systems. And I think this was in the late 80s, might have been the early 90s. And the original instantiation of this company ran into what they called the black hole. And this is directly relevant to what you're talking about, Stuart. The system would try to follow a chain of thought, which is a term we're using now, and inevitably get to a point where it couldn't work its way back to the original question, and collapsed. So they couldn't deliver. And then the company pivoted and became a cybersecurity company and did a whole bunch of other software, and actually ended up going public and got bought. But the beginning of that company was trying to accomplish a lot of what you're talking about today, and it wasn't possible. And there is a level at which maybe it's still not possible today. When you talk about agents going off and manipulating data on a browser on your behalf, the potential for failure is way bigger than 0.01%. I'm, the expectations being set right now that you're going to have these intelligent agents that could go book flights for you and manage your calendar and do all this other stuff. And it's like, I just don't believe it. If that was true, it would have already been done.
Yes, so Claude now has access to my computer. I've given it access to its root files, basically, and it's going off and doing things. And I have to be very, very wary of what exactly it's doing. And I'm going to bring a lot of computers or a lot of humans into the loop to help me navigate this crazy stuff. But let's go into reality disturbance. Jim, where did the name reality disturbance come from? How did you hit upon that?
Well, it came from me simply as a way to do two things. One is to try to describe kind of what I thought was happening, but secondly, to kind of give it a hook and a little bit of a marketing pizzazz so that people would go, well, what the hell is that? You could say reality disruption, but in our business, disruption's used all the time and that type of thing. And I also didn't want it to be necessarily, a total negative. It's just a disturbance from what we normally have, and how do you capitalize on that? So that's just kind of how it evolved, for better or for worse.
And we did have to disagree with each other for a while, because I kept thinking the phrase reality disturbance, and disturbance is one of those kind of squishy words. Can't quite figure out what it means, and so it doesn't mean something. But we've adopted it, and now we get to infuse it with the meaning that we're giving it.
Yeah, and as an old ad man, oftentimes you have a tagline, and that new tagline is meaningless. And what happens over time, it's an empty basket, and you fill that basket with context, and that's then becomes the power of the tagline. Whether it's, at face value, just do it. What is that? But 30, 40 years later, it has a tremendous amount. So, and then being the ad man I am as well, I do like to be a little provocative. And when you hear reality disturbance, it's like, okay, what you got me. It's just a little bit of
and us journalists, it's like I like to start up too. But going all the way back to VisiCalc, which most people don't even know what it is now, was called a spreadsheet. And what most people thought of as a spreadsheet was a piece of paper with rows and columns on it, and you had to fill those things in. And people couldn't figure out what you meant when there was a spreadsheet running on a computer. And they tried coming up with all different kinds of names, but ultimately the digital spreadsheet overwhelmed the traditional spreadsheets. Now we just call them spreadsheets, and nobody knows what the original idea of a spreadsheet was.
Okay, that's really interesting. Jim, where did you learn how to be an admin, and where did you get, and how does it intersect with the rise of the PC industry, or with the rise of the media industry?
Well, I was a political science major as an undergrad, which was fascinating to me, but I quickly discovered like kind of useless unless I wanted to be a teacher. And I had an advisor that said, well, you should think about going to graduate school. And back when I did that, now kids graduate and go work for a while, and then they go back to grad school. Back in my day, you could do it kind of sequentially. I didn't view myself as a businessman. I'd only taken a couple classes, and I thought, oh my God, I couldn't handle an MBA. But I got introduced to a school called Thunderbird, which was at that point the leading school of international management. And that was kind of intriguing. And I looked at the makeup of the student body, and 60% were from foreign countries. And there were people that were like, I remember seeing specifically there's a woman who's a major in ballet. And I thought, oh, okay, well, if she could handle it, I probably could handle it as well. And so blindly, I went down there. And luckily in that school, there was a track called Interad, International Advertising. And I took a class, and as often happens, and I found a mentor, a guy named Paul Schlesinger, who was the former chairman of Tatham Laird Kudner, which is a famous Chicago packaged goods advertising agency. And he had retired down to Phoenix, Arizona, and came over to be a professor. And he infused me with all things advertising and took me under his arm. And we had a program where you would go out and recruit a real world company to pay you money to do a marketing advertising plan. And so I went out and got Mattel Toys in LA to give me some money, and I formed a team, and they wanted a marketing plan to introduce Barbie, Hot Wheels, and Masters of the Universe, this is in the 80s, into the country of Chile, which was odd because at that point, Chile was undergoing an uproar. I mean, it was like, what? And
yeah, revolution. Yeah.
Crazy. It was the banking system was on the verge of collapse, and I went back to them and said, look, if I were a real agency, I'd recommend you not do that. And they're like, yeah, we know, just go ahead and do it anyway. Long story short, this program ended up being judged by advertising professionals from around New York, Chicago, LA that were contacts of this Paul Schlesinger guy. And out of that, I got interviews with a number of agencies, two of which I got offers from. One was an agency called BBDO in New York, and the other was Doyle Dane Bernbach. And I ended up accepting the offer from Doyle Dane Bernbach because I was infatuated by the creative revolution they had created in the 60s with their famous Volkswagen campaign and, Think Different, and which ultimately led to Think Different and the campaigns like that. So at any rate, I got involved there. And then one day I was traveling home on a New Jersey Transit train to Edison, New Jersey, where I lived at the time. And the train in front of us derailed and we were stuck. And a woman in my train car went into labor. And luckily, a train parallel to us had a doctor. He jumped off, got into the car, and a group of, Willy Lomans who had been doing this for 50 years, drinking beers on the train, commuting, stood around, watched the baby being born on our train car. And the lead Willy Loman looked around and said, "Hey, everybody, should we charge it a one-way or round trip?" And that's when it struck me that okay, I am not going to turn into this Willy Loman guy riding a train in New York and the whole thing. So I ended up looking west, young man, and I always felt more comfortable in the West. It was not as formal. I didn't like three-piece Brook Brothers suits. As Stuart knows, I don't take. I'm a little radical, and I don't like authority and all of that. And so I ended up getting a job at an agency called BBDO in Los Angeles, and about a year into that, BBDO won the Apple computer business because John Scully had used BBDO at Pepsi. And Phil Dusenberry, who's the madman of BBDO, was John's right-hand man. So he gave the account after Steve got ousted from Chiat to BBDO. Phil Dusenberry, realizing that it's great we have the account, but we don't know shit about computers. We know how to sell sugar water, but we sure as shit don't know about computers. Lured a guy named Steve Hayden from Chiat, who had written the famous 1984 commercial, over to BBDO. And then there's a long story, but I kind of had to fight my way to get on the Apple account. But my shining moment was going up in 1986 to Moscone to see that one of the very first Mac Worlds and being hit with a bolt of lightning that this was the Jetsons, this thing called the Macintosh was the future. And I got to do whatever I could do to be a part of it. I was also introduced at that point to a great program called HyperCard. So I went home and wrote a HyperCard program about myself and why I should be on the Apple business. At the time, I was on a Sizzler restaurants account. And I went to the powers that be, and Steve Hayden, and in my sort of naive gumption, stood in front of the entire Apple team and gave my HyperCard presentation on why I should be that. And they were blown away that I had learned HyperTalk, which was the code, to do the HyperCard thing, because none of them even knew how to do it. And it was kind of esoteric at the time. They're like, wow, this guy's kind of a nerd. And so I fought my way and got onto the Apple business, and then worked my way up the ladder and ended up running it, and then the LA office of BBDO and all that kind of stuff. And because of that, got fully immersed in Apple, the rise of the personal computer in the late 80s and the 90s, and followed your father as a pundit in the industry very closely. That's kind of my ad journey there.
So yeah, brilliant. A lot of different follow-up points. I want to ask my dad later on about how you guys met and your maybe potentially your differing or similar stories on how you met. But the real thing that keeps on coming back to me is Steve Jobs, 1984. This guy was a rebel, and then all of a sudden he became the man. By the time he became the man, like, and I mean this in the man in the IBM sense of essentially like he was creating culture as the head of Apple with the iPad, with all of these different things. Do either of you agree, and either of you can take this, but do you agree about that Steve Jobs started as a rebel and then somehow became the creator of culture, and like what that yeah.
So some of the background is I got Stuart to read Brent Schlender's book about Steve Jobs called Becoming Steve, which basically documents exactly what he's talking about. And it's still not totally understood that Steve, after he went back to Apple, figured out how to run a technology company and organize that technology company to deal with changes in technology and to keep up with it, which I personally think they've lost now. But and he instituted things like the Apple University and the annual offsite of not just executives. And so he intellectualized his ability to be the rebel and make Apple a fast-moving technology company, which really, at some level, Jensen Huang at NVIDIA has been modeling. Yells at people, and he forces everybody to deal with what's going on, and instead of kind of hiding behind the politics. And Steve was a master of that, and Bill, at some level, early on, was a master as well. There is a sense, and it's still, people haven't really figured it out, that Steve Jobs is the Thomas Watson of the modern age. Thomas Watson was the guy that built IBM. And you're right, IBM was the previous model.
What do you think, Jim?
Yeah, absolutely. Steve always was a rebel, and Stuart's right. It's just the second time around, he had matured enough to be able to figure out how to leverage that in a productive way versus, the sort of chaos that and look, by the way, Stuart and I see this all the time, and we won't get into a direct analog, but you have young entrepreneurs who are young CEOs that want to, change the world, but they want to boil the ocean, and oftentimes it's so disruptive that they eat themselves alive, and sometimes they have to go away, face the winter of their discontent, go into the wilderness years, learn, and then come back. And just to be clear, so I wasn't involved with Apple in 1984. I got involved with Apple in 86 when BBDO kind of won the account in the John Sculley years. However, my boss, this Steve Hayden guy who wrote the famous 1984 commercial, knew in the back of his mind that one day the prodigal son would have to return to Apple, because at the end of the day, it was his baby, and that ultimately he would. And he was off having a temper tantrum, et cetera. And so Steve, he didn't know when it would happen, but he thought, well, you know what? We need to make Steve happy and keep ties with him in the case that he comes back. And so Steve would bring me along with him to Next, where we would go sort of, religiously to check in with Steve Jobs. And that's how I got to originally know Steve, was in the context of Next. And so we go over and first, Jobs would rail against Apple. He'd rail against BBDO. Chiat Day was, the savior. And how could you be a traitor, Steve, and go to BBDO? And we just get the wrath of Steve. But over time, we could see him kind of realizing that, hey, I'm maturing, I'm learning things. And Next, unfortunately, wasn't ultimately cracked up to what he wanted it to be. And
Yeah, but let me insert here, because the amazing thing is that Apple ended up buying Next, and the Next OS, which Steve had been working on for that period of time between Apple One and Apple Two, if you will, the is the basis for the Macintosh operating system and the fundamental concepts of an operating system that is fungible, that can migrate across chipsets and change its application layer and still be an integral operating system. That was it, right? When they married what was originally NextOS, became macOS with the ARM architecture, that's the macOS now with the M series chips and the concepts were built into the iPhone when it came along. And that's sort of right at the core of everything that's happened that Microsoft never figured out. And certainly AT&T and Unix never figured out that Steve packaged the technology in a way that even if he wasn't an engineer and knew how to code himself, he understood how to make the package that would work and be as extensible as it has been.
I mean, he understands the beautiful integration of software and hardware that nobody else did. And, but at any rate, I mean, look, and then Scully left, and it's often maligned, but you got to remember, John took that company from 800 million to 8 billion over a decade. I mean, he was actually a really great CEO. The shit happened when he left and the board kicked him out because it's like an NFL coach. You're only as good as your latest win. And Spindler took over the Diesel and talked about, an acquisition with Sun and all this stuff. Morale was going down. He hired a U.S. president named Bob Puett, and it just, the rats kind of fled the ship. And it was the opening for Steve then, after maturing, to come back and do what he ultimately did, So, and at that point in time, my whole team, my boss, Steve Hayden, went off to run the new Lou Gerstner regime at IBM to turn IBM around because they were shit. And Steve was instrumental in that entire turnaround. I went off to run I was a trader to run the global Microsoft account and the introduction of Windows 95. And my other colleagues scurried into the wind and started leading other technology forces, but that core of what we all learned and did at Apple, impacted an entire sort of industry in terms of what we did. So
really interesting. So yeah, Dad, where did you guys first meet?
I was trying to think of that.
Stuart doesn't remember. I met Stuart in the 80s at either one of his events or somehow, but I met him. He's not going to remember me because I was a young, loudmouth ad guy, whatever. But that's when I met him. And so I was sort of in awe of him because he was this pundit guy, and he was hanging with all of the CEOs and the whole thing. And then full circle, I was on the board of a school that my kids went to in San Francisco, and I met this guy named Gilman Louie, who was also on the board. And Gilman and I were clearly the rabble rousers on this board, and were simpatico and challenging the status quo. And he said, "Well, I formed a venture capital firm with a guy named Stewart Alsop," and I'm like, "Oh my God!" And he goes, "Would you like to get involved?" And it was like, I don't know what I'm doing, but yeah, it'd be really cool. And I have all of the.
Wait, have you ever been an investor before that? Or was that your first time investing? Oh, interesting.
So that's why in the pitch we characterize Jim as an operator and me as an investor.
Yeah,
but Jim's run stuff.
I wanna go into that a little bit more, maybe for the last 5 or 10 minutes, and if you have to go at the hour, let me know. the operator, what, like, and specifically, it sounds like you started to do more operating at Lucasfilms. Is that right? When did you start operating?
Well, look, it depends on how you define an
Yeah.
operator. In the advertising world, I had P&L responsibility for $500 million, advertising accounts across thousands of people around the world in our network, right? So, I launched the original PowerBook. I then went on and launched Windows 95 with the Rolling Stones and Start Me Up with an agency called White & Kennedy. I went on to run the global Nike business, introduced a young man to the world named Tiger Woods. That's all operational stuff, although albeit on an agency side. I went client side at Lucasfilm with George Lucas and ended up having operational responsibility for our revenue streams in the theatrical home video, what we then called pay free TV. I was president of LucasArts, a video game company, had to turn that around. And then, and that was for over a decade. And then connected with Stewart and Gilman. And my sort of forte became to be both a CEO horse whisperer, if you will. And then Stewart and Gilman would also send me into, I was kind of a fix-it guy, to send me into some of the more problematic or challenging, if you will, portfolio companies to help out. And then also we had this process called the God Particle, which is a whole other discussion to help founders discover their true north as well. And so,
do the pig thing, just so we get it.
I'm sorry?
Do the pig thing. So we're sitting in an offsite, at Alsop and where all the partners are sitting around. We're kind of figure out what to do with the portfolio and so forth. And Jim says, kind of raises his hand and says, "So, do you?" No, you do it, because I can't remember exactly how you said it.
We were discussing, what is the best way to optimize our selection of founders, which is a variable in making an investment. In fact, maybe one of the most important. And Stewart was leading the discussion, and I just said, well, look, I think we need to find pigs who speak in tongues who can hold true north. And and everyone's like, what, this guy's just lost his mind. And well, what do you mean by that? And I'm like, okay, well, if you take a plate of bacon and eggs, the chicken was involved in that breakfast, but the pig was committed. So first of all, we need that level of commitment. We need pigs that are going to kill themselves for this concept. The second is people that speak in tongues. And oftentimes we hear many, many different kinds of pitches with, we're going to disrupt this category. And, in about 5 minutes, you can sniff out whether the founder has domain experience or they're just using buzzy words and don't really even know what they're talking about. But every once in a while, you'll come across somebody that does know what the shit they're talking about, and they're using frontier language that you might not even fully understand, but intuitively that they're on to something big, and that's a big idea. And the third part is, can they hold true north? Because yes, you need to pivot and kind of find your way in terms of a startup, but what drives investors crazy is if you start off in the widget business and show up now making skis. It's like, whoa, what happened? We just wasted 3 years of time, energy, and valuable resource only to be nowhere near where we thought we were going in the first place. So the litmus test is, and Stuart and I still do this today, is, are we talking to a pig? Is he speaking in tongues? And do we believe he ultimately can hold true north? And the true north part of that, to help identify that and help founders keep that true north, is a process we call the God particle process, which helps them, really tune that in.
So can you go more into that? Like, how do you actually find and then hold true north? How can you recognize that in someone?
Well, the God particle process, emerged out of the early 90s. And I read a book called The God Particle, which was about the particle physicist's search for the fundamental building block of the entire universe, which 30 years later, we've now found it's called the Higgs boson, which, everything is built upon. But it occurred to me that, yeah, that's pretty cool. This fundamental building block that at the end of the day, a company should be built around that, and that it should use that as a strategic filter for decisions it makes and to make sure that it's not wandering on to different crazy paths. And so it's a process we utilize with our portfolio companies. The first is a 3 to 4 hour session where we sit down. I set the table for what I mean by it, and we give a couple of case study examples of God particles that have disrupted industries, like Apple's, like Nike's, like Lucasfilms, from my Meow Wolf, from my experience. And then we guide the founders in a therapy session of self-discovery, because usually there is a fundamental reason they started the company. And most of the time they're not even very, every once in a while you find something that is, but most of the time they can't articulate it very well. Or if they do, and they happen to be an engineer as a founder, God help us, because it's 2 pages of gobbledygook shit that's like, what are you fucking talking about? And that affects them in the future in terms of how they're going to pitch the company on raises and everything. So we break it down, we chip it down, we go to that fundamental God particle, the atomos, that which cannot be cut, to make sure that they understand that and are focused on that. And that happens through a series of fundamental meetings. We let it bake a while, then we come back, we stress test it, we use it in real world experiences. Does this actually help you? Blah, 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 blah. And then it begins to permeate out, affecting hopefully things that they do.
Okay.
And
So
it doesn't always work.
nothing.
That's correct. It doesn't, in theory, it can work, but oftentimes we'll find that founders will do this and then they'll park it and then go off and just forget about it and do what they want. And so oftentimes they need a swift kick up against the head about that as well.
So last question, how does that apply to Steve Jobs? And like, how did Steve Jobs find the God particle, or how does that relate to Apple as it is?
Well, Steve Jobs intuitively understood one fundamental fact, that these things called computers needed to be able to help you do what you needed to do, whether that was change the world or simply do an Excel spreadsheet. And so that the concept of simplicity was in fact the God particle of Apple. And however that's expressed, our tagline was the power to be your best, or later on, think different, and the technology allowed you to do that, whatever it happens to be. But that fundamental God particle was simplicity. And what he pioneered was this beautiful integration of software and hardware, leveraging entirely new concepts like a GUI that was a desktop metaphor, a thing called a mouse that, obviously it had pre-existed, but he made that a reality to navigate this desktop. And all of those technologies that infused everything Apple continues to do this day in terms of design, or the simplicity of a personal assistant, or everything Apple does is about empowering you to do what you need to do, leveraging technology as a tool, but not a tool for itself. Because IBM, Microsoft, everybody else was about the technology for technology's sake. But if you ever had to navigate the green jungle of MS-DOS with keyboard prompts, and for a guy like me, it was like, what the fuck? But all of a sudden, the minute I got on a Mac, my world completely changed. So that God particle of simplicity, Steve inherently knew, and he drove it like a madman, often to his detriment, to change the entire world,
Beautiful.
And he did it time and time again, not just with a personal computer. He recognized the complexity of the music industry and how fucked up that was, and solved that problem. He understood the complexity or the tardiness of the telecom industry and revolutionized that. Every time he did this. And stupidly, most of these industries never understood it, or they were asleep at the switch. And he would go in and knock them on the head and wake them up and shove it in. And sure enough, he was right. That's why Stuart's right. Tom Watson, whatever. He's a god to me,
It's so interesting, because it's another episode maybe in the future is like why everybody else just rests on the status quo and kind of does what everyone else is doing, and why are these strange Silicon Valley assholes, as my dad would say it, ready to go in there and actually create this new experience.
We could talk about further ones too. Elon Musk is a remarkable individual for whatever you think about him and whatever the hell he's up to now with Doge. But the fact that he started these fundamental companies that have transformed multiple industries. Is like, that's unheard of. Steve did one industry.
Well, thank you both so much for your time, and looking forward to the next one.
Okay, sounds great. Thank you.